if I have to say how I got into psychology, either it is by accident or there's a very, very long development ahead of it. Experiences that just reminded one or taught one that there is something psychological behind a variety of things. For instance, I once heard a story about a man who had cancer. He was a farmer somewhere in the Free State. They came to Johannesburg at that time to come to a specialist who told him he had 6 months to live. And according to them, they told the story to me and my father. They, that night in the hotel room, went on their knees and they said to the Lord, he knew that he couldn't die now. He had small children, a farm that was full of debt and all kinds of things. And in any case, that's how it started, but in the end, 6 months later he came back and there was no sign of the cancer. Now, I'm not telling this to prove that religion solves problems, but there is psychological stuff behind that makes you think. And so I can go on with other stories that now, looking back many years later, I can see that those things caused an interest, sort of opened you up to certain things. And if I tell you that my father was a minister of religion, then that probably contributed. Although I have to add that I sometimes jokingly say that I'm little Samuel. I was taken to the temple and then he ran away from the temple. So don't take this kind of introduction as overly religious. I went to university planning to study medicine, and I took the ordinary, or at that time ordinary first year subjects of physics, chemistry, botany, zoology. But then I switched to a degree in physical education in my second year. It was a newly introduced degree. And I needed an extra subject, and I took Psychology 1. By the end of the year, I once sat talking to a second-year student. I said to him, this is a stupid subject, it's boring. And it really was boring in those days. And the way it was taught, particularly we had the professor was Professor J.M. Hartung, and he was brilliant. His classes were the kind where after 45 minutes you were astonished that the period is over. But the other two guys were young assistants, and they sort of read their notes, and it was terrible. And then he told me about psychopathology and child psychology that they do in the second year. I said, well, perhaps I'll try it another year. And that was the beginning of the end. From there, I never looked back. I wanted to study medicine. And those days, it was terribly difficult to get into a medical school. There weren't enough places, and you had to have probably an honors or a master's degree to get in. And I couldn't even get my BSc finished, because I then switched back to, that's another story, leave it out, switched back to BSc. I had physiology as a major, and for that I needed 2 years of chemistry. And I couldn't pass the chemistry, but I had to get chemistry to understand the biochemistry and physiology. I got high marks, 85% and around there for my biochemistry, but I failed the chemistry. So it took some time before I eventually got my BSc. In fact, when I took chemistry the second time, chemistry 2 the second time, I already started with honors. One of the best things that happened to me was an accident, or the result of an accident. The library of Potchefstroom University burned down. And then all the journals for psychology came to the department. I was an honor student that year, and I was put in charge of that for, I think I got £10 a month for it. But the result was, when the new journal arrived, I was the first one to look through it, and that created a love for journals. It was really a privilege. I was the only full-time honor student that year. Dawie Gous was also an honor student then, and because he was working at the NIPR full-time in psychology, he was allowed to do it part-time in 1 year. So he and I now and then had classes together about every second week. But for the rest, I was the only one there, and of course I had tea with the professor, and one was by then a lecturer and the assistant and so on. And so I had opportunities to hear stories and be referred to this and that and so on. And it was just a wonderful time. I was a first-year student in 1946. I got my honors in 51, early 51, and I finished my master's in 1953, it must have been. For my master's degree, I did research on an assistantship. I was paid £25 a month. Out of that, I bought a typewriter and I bought an engagement ring. I'm still astonished that I could do things like that in so little. But in any case, it was a really good experience because it was a grant from what is now the HSRC to Professor Hartung. And it was just a wonderful opportunity. It was on manual dexterity tests. Today it would have counted as an industrial psychology project, but at that time industrial psychology wasn't an independent field yet. I worked at what is now the HSRC for 5 months after I left the university, working on the new South African group test, intelligence test. I wrote many of the items that went into the final test. I left there for a new job at the South African Railways, and that lasted 5 months. I was working for Professor Skavron. He used to be professor at Pretoria University. And there's a long story to that too, how he left and how he didn't get his job back when he left and when he came back. But I worked there for 5 months, which was just long enough to teach me how not to do personnel selection. And I got an opportunity to go to Diepkloof Reformatory, which was here outside Johannesburg, a reformatory for black boys, and spent a year there. While I was there, I finished writing up my thesis. And then on the 25th of September, 1953, I received a letter from Professor Hartung to say that I was going to get my master's degree with distinction, and that I should expect a letter from the registrar of the university offering me a lectureship, and I should consider seriously to accept it. And to crown it all, 5 o'clock that afternoon, my eldest son was born. 3 things on one day. That's unforgettable. So the next year I went back to Potchefstroom. I was there for 3 years. When I went to America for a PhD. For 2.5 years I was there, Purdue University, and I did an internship in Indianapolis at Child Guidance Clinic there and at an outpatient psychiatric hospital. August of 1959 I was back in Potchefstroom. Immediately started planning, well, I had started this already in America, but planning a master's degree in clinical psychology. Eventually we established 2 master's degrees, one in clinical and one in child clinical psychology. And they were the first clinical programs, specifically clinical programs in the country. Dawie Gous and Dr. Lejeune, who was teaching here at Wits, she later on went back to England. came and talked to me about what we had done, and the next year Wits started one too. I have to add that Stellenbosch had an MA in what they called abnormal psychology before that, and that was an early start in the clinical direction, but they didn't really have a clinical program. So that was a marvelous opportunity to really build something, develop something. I saw 3 students through the MA in clinical. Because it was a full-time degree, it was hard for people who were working elsewhere. And in fact, all 3 of them finished it long after they had done the coursework, but I mainly did the teaching, and it was a heavy load. People nowadays can't think how hard we taught, how hard we worked at simple, straightforward teaching. By the time I left Potchefstroom, I had 23 hours of lecturing per week, which I thought was crazy, and I couldn't see why we should do it. The problem was that universities in those days were terribly poor, and they had small departments. Just in front of our building was geology, for instance, which had just a few students. And then they had subjects like Hebrew and Latin and things for theology students, which very few students took, but they needed staff for those. So we were teaching heavy loads so that there would be money available for them. I don't know how many master students I had, part-time people working on theses, but in any case, I got fed up with it. I moaned about it, and I moaned at high levels about it. There was a possibility of a job at the NIPR, which Dawie Gous offered me. It was to be liaison with the military system, the military research. And in the end, the reason why I didn't accept it, was simply because I was supposed to do confidential work. Dawie told me I couldn't talk about any of my work with anyone. I said, no, that's not for me. And nothing would get published. It was hush-hush, everything. That's, of course, silly, because some of it is good research that could just as well be published for the rest of the world. But I then said, no, I can't do that kind of work, and so I didn't come. But then shortly afterwards, the University of Port Elizabeth was established, and I was appointed there, and I started at with Appel van Aarde, who's still around. We started the department. There were 18 professors to begin the university, and I don't know how many senior lecturers, hardly any lecturers. We started off with Psychology 1 and Honours, and then added Psychology 2 the next year, Psychology 3 the year after that. That was a fantastic experience. I've never been in so many meetings per year as I was there, because it was just committee work all the way through. How do we do this? How do we do that? It was the first new university to be established in lots of time, not many years. The staff that came there, among the professors, there was one institution of higher learning that was not represented in South Africa. So that it was an incredible mix of people. And everyone was handpicked. That was the cream of academics in South Africa. Well, of what was available in South Africa. Dawie Gous, for instance, said he couldn't come. He was supposed to be the professor of industrial psychology, and he said he couldn't come because he had started things here that he just couldn't drop at that stage. It was unbelievably stimulating. In any case, I was still teaching clinical psychology, but then I discovered McClelland, David McClelland, and his achievement motivation particularly. I wrote into the syllabus a course on motivation psychology for the second-year students. And Bok Murray was going to come to us as a lecturer the next year, and I had to tell Bok what more or less he had to teach. So I started reading about motivation a bit, and it just grabbed me. I taught that course, and then eventually taught motivation at the honors level. And for years I was involved in motivation, mainly achievement motivation. I eventually developed a program on achievement orientation for Sanlam, which we ran quite a few times. But that was a phase of achievement motivation. Along the way, power motivation came into it, and Victor Nell and I had a paper published on his master's thesis, one that was internationally published, on which McClelland gave us very favorable comments. Then I became interested in personal autonomy. And with John Tilley, who's still practicing here in Johannesburg, and Peter Hartz, who's been in Vancouver for donkey's years already, they were my research assistants. We put together a questionnaire. And so it went on and on. Questionnaires were my thing. Then really through the achievement motivation, because the work that of McClelland and David Winter did really interesting work in India, where they influenced small business through teaching achievement orientation. And it was a takeoff on their program that we developed for Sanlam, but certainly a local thing, because they never, in fact, I was in their offices in Boston. They showed me the handout that's given to the people, but it was empty. There were no lectures or anything in it. So I couldn't really find out what they were doing. I had to do it from the description in a book and a journal article. Through those kinds of things, I became interested in organizational kind of things, organizational psychology. Although it wasn't really called organizational psychology at that time. It was still just industrial psychology. And then I found out that there was going to be a workshop, a 3-day workshop in Somerset West, taught by 2 Dutchmen from the NPI. It used to be the Nederlands Pedagogisch Instituut, but they abbreviated it to NPI. And I sort of got the rector to agree that this was something in motivational psychology and stuff that I was teaching, so he sent me there. And that really turned me on to organizational psychology, and Rensis Leckert was prominent. I bought the book afterwards, read it later on, bought his second book and read it, and I really strongly became interested in organizational, but I couldn't teach it because there was the Department of Industrial Psychology next door with Ampie Miller and Louis Kampfer, and later on Roo van der Merwe. But in any case, then I had a sabbatical and went to UCLA for a month-long course on organization development, and half of the time we spent in sensitivity training. At the end of the first week, I said to a good friend there were 17 of us, I said to a friend there, I now feel on top of the world. It was marvelous. You couldn't believe that you could feel so good. At the end of the second week, I said to him, I feel as if I'm walking on jelly now. By the third week, I was just almost in depression. And then the last week they spent putting us together. It was one of the most important experiences of my life. There was Robert Tannenbaum. Bob Tannenbaum was in charge of the program. And he actually was an accountant by training, but he was one of the best people, really a top person in the field of OD and sensitivity training, personal development kind of stuff. And we had lecturers from TRW and such companies came in to talk to us about organization development. Okay, I came back with all of this stuff. I made a tour of universities through Canada and America, USA, including Harvard University, where I met McClelland. I couldn't get an appointment with him. He said he was too busy. He couldn't make appointments ahead of time. I just arrived in his office, and I said to the secretary, could I see him? No, he's flying off this afternoon somewhere. I said, but his name is mentioned in every lecture of mine. I can't go away if I don't meet this man. She said, well, she'll go in and see. And she said, then I should come. There's his cabinet, filing cabinet. He said I should look what's in there, and if there's any, it's all of his reprints. I can take whatever I want, and he will see me during the lunch hour. So we had 3/4 of an hour together, which was marvelous. I've had so many marvelous things happen to me. In any case, I was there and at several other universities in connection with motivation and organizational stuff and so on. Came back. There was Louis Camphor with precisely the same interests as mine. He didn't go to UCLA or to NTL for his development. He went to, what's the place in England for his training. And we worked together a lot. Eventually I did teach 2 courses on social psychology and organization development to honor students in industrial. But I was kind of out of it. I couldn't teach what I wanted to teach. The other part of that story is that by then I wanted to emigrate. I was just desperate to get out of the country. Political stuff. I was doing sensitivity training with students left, right, and center. And to the nationalists, that was taboo. As a result, I had a dossier with the security police, and I knew about it because one of the informers tried to play it both ways and tried to threaten me with this bit of knowledge that he had. And certainly what he told me about what the police were asking about me was inside personal information that was quite shocking. But that was sort of one reason that I wanted to just get away. Another reason was that when I was putting together the questions for the personal autonomy questionnaire, I just collected items all over, published stuff, existing stuff that could be related to it, and we started off with about 200 plus items from which we eventually selected about 40. But we then, it had the 2 assistants administered the questionnaires in Afrikaans and in English. We did item analyses. And I one evening sat looking at the items that finally sort of survived. And there was one item, and I still remember where it originated, but it said that communism couldn't be all wrong or something to that effect. Kind of open-minded this item. I thought, oh heck, if the security police saw this one, I'd be in real trouble. So I'd better replace it with another one. And it really shocked me. I said to myself, what the hell are you trying to do here? For political reasons, change an item that had been selected completely according to the rules of psychometry. Experiences like that, really, it's a tiny thing. It's minute. But when you put it in context, you just say, well, if this is where I have to live, I want to get out. So I started applying to go overseas, first to Canada, Canada, USA, a bit Australia. At one point there, I got a letter from one of the Canadian universities where the guy said it's the second time now that they've decided they could really use me, but the rule is that you have to come for a colloquium, and they don't have the money to get me all the way. I said, I'll come at my own expense, so I went. But then I simply went to another university for a colloquium, or 2 others for a colloquium, And at one, they actually appointed me, and then afterwards decided no, but they couldn't. They had a change in staff that left, and I wouldn't then fit into the new pattern. That I heard long afterwards. But I did get a temporary appointment replacing somebody at the University of Regina in the Faculty of Administration, and that's where I really taught personnel management and or human resource management and organizational psychology for a year. I was working with an Indian guy who was the senior there, and he was a most useful friend. He would give me, well, look at this book, look at this case study, and so on. And it was a year in which I actually worked myself into organizational psychology, published even in that field while I was there. Could have had an appointment as an associate professor at University of Regina, but I said I can't come down this far in the world because an associate professorship didn't have tenure. Full professor, you immediately have tenure. And I couldn't take a chance on that. I said I have a family to look after, and I couldn't take chances. And the dean said, well, we'll think about it, and then he went on sabbatical and nothing happened, so I came back. But then I got a job in Australia. Just after I came back here from Canada, I had a heart attack in 1976. And the Australians in the end said they didn't want a person who suffers from heart disease, and I didn't get in there. Shortly after that, I got a second appointment in Australia, a beautiful job at a medical school. I just had to write and say, your government doesn't want me to get there. So that was the end of my attempts. It was the best thing that could have happened to me that I didn't get out, because subsequently I learned more about Australian psychology, and at that time it certainly was boring. It was hopelessly experimental. But what happened then, I then went into private practice for 2 years in Port Elizabeth because I had resigned from UPE. I also wanted to get out of there. I didn't want to stay there anymore. I was in private practice for 2 years. It was also a really worthwhile period in my life. But I then got a job here at Wits Business School to teach organizational behavior. That was another really marvelous stretch of my career, because it was all interdisciplinary. There were all kinds of people there teaching various subjects, really top people, brilliant people. But there were constantly visitors, overseas visitors, local visitors. You could go to the tea room any morning and there would be some European or some American or whatever. So that was an incredible period. But eventually I felt that I wasn't teaching my subject anymore. Some of it was more or less almost first year kind of stuff, but since it was mature students, it was something different. It was a different level. But when I got a job offer at UCT to start industrial psychology there, I was willing to accept. It cost me 18% in my salary, but it was worth it. Rita and I went down. She became senior lecturer there, and I was professor. Later on, Charles Cogill, who had been here with us at Wits, who then went to Natal University, also came down to Cape Town again, and we were then 3 teaching industrial there. That went on for 10 years. I taught organizational psychology and occupational health psychology because that's what I was interested in by then. The way I got into that was that when I had to do my inaugural address here at Wits, I did it on executive distress, executive eustress, and what makes the difference. In the process of writing about it, I came across a reference to Antonovsky, who was an Israeli medical sociologist. And he really grabbed me. he published a second book, which I immediately ordered, and we had an opportunity to go and teach at Ben Gurion University over the Christmas and January period. And then I met Antonovsky too, who was at that same university. We were teaching not in a different faculty. He was at the medical school. I met him in total 4 times, but we became correspondents, and I would send him stuff that I wrote and he would comment on it. He was an incredible person to know. But his emphasis was on what he called salutogenesis, the origins of health. Eventually I wrote an article to summarize this change of direction in thinking, that it is on health that we should place the emphasis and not pathology. Well, not denying pathology, but there's life elsewhere too, much more life in fact. I first wrote an article in which I summarized the existing stuff at that time. Then I wrote another article subsequently in which I said that what he was talking about is not just health, physical health, but it's strength all over wherever people function. And I then, with the help of a professor of Latin at UCT, developed the name of fortogenesis, the origins of strength. Fortis is strength. And that was for most of what was left of my life became where I'm functioning, that I'm interested in fortogenesis, what helps people to be strong at work, in their physical health, in their families, in bringing up children, community things, strength all over the place. Well, to begin with, it's a very different way of looking at psychological things, except it's not just psychology. And the problem with what we actually, well, I shouldn't say we because it was Antonovsky, but okay, I was involved. Marie Wissing at Potchefstroom is also very prominent in this field. And of course there are lots of other people, but all of us, in Scandinavian countries, there's a strong, particularly now in Sweden and in Finland, there's a strong move in this direction. It was a new field that was developing. And we were into it before positive psychology started in 2000. Antonovsky published in 1979 and 87. Marie Wissing and a colleague of hers talked about, and taking off from my fortogenesis, they talk about fortology, psychofortology. Now, fortology and salutogenesis, fortogenesis, is present in all disciplines, sociology, social work, and all kinds of things, even economics. But specifically in psychology, this was a completely different emphasis, and that is why positive psychology took off so well. Simply because traditionally we were interested in pathology, psychopathology, what makes people sick, why are people like this and that, and why do they make such a mess of the bringing up their children? But in the meantime, what's the other side of it? What helps people to be strong? And when you start looking at the world through that kind of spectacles, it is fantastically interesting. I used to say to students, we know that there's about 10% of a population are people who are at the bottom end of the distribution. They mentally ill or mentally retarded, etc., but they're sick people. But from there up along a very long curve, people are in various degrees normal and gradually become better and better. It's over to the end. It's healthy people, strong people. And the opposite 10% at the other end are really superb people. They are brilliant. They are capable to do things that are unbelievable. They are the cream of humanity. But we know so little about this 90% of the curve. The other 10% at the right-hand end, we know fairly much about. But all of these other people who are functioning all over this normal curve, we ignore them. We're just hammering this little bit at the bottom. So it's a different way of looking at it. And Maslow already started pointing in that direction. He was another person that really influenced me. For a while there, I was quite strongly humanistic and couldn't see anything wrong with the human race until I realized that this is going too far. And then I read in a book that was published after his death that Maslow himself said, after Hitler and Stalin, you can't be a humanist. It is an orientation towards psychology that took off like a fire. It was a house on fire, and the house almost burned down as a result of it. But at the same time, it does not mean that positive psychology or psychophotology will ignore the rest. If you read Antonovsky, he makes it very, very clear that the negative things are really overwhelmingly present. There's so much sadness, so much illness, so much deprivation, all things negative are constantly present in human existence. But the point that he is making, and that this whole approach is making, is that people don't just sit there and gradually die. They get out of it. They develop further. They go on. They overcome things. There was a time when, particularly, for instance, when I was a boy and later on, where cancer was a death sentence, and we accepted cancer as a death sentence. But then if you look at it nowadays in particular, people survive cancer all the time. And my own wife, Rita, had breast cancer, which got into her hip eventually, and she had a metastasis in her back eventually, in her spine. And this was 1993. She was on her way to the graveyard, but she's still around. Okay, there's a long, long story behind that bit. But the fact is that people do survive cancer. They do survive. I mean, I had a heart attack. I've had 2 bypasses. And from 1976 to now is a long time already. I've survived it, and I've been very active. And medicine is a marvelous discipline. I'm using the word marvelous too often, but that is how I look at the world. It's a marvelous place. And marvelous things happen all the time. And people survive as a result of that. Work experiences are terrible in many places, but there are also people who are joyful wherever they work. They seem to find a way to do it differently or to overcome. And that's that overcoming part that is so important, and that we tended to ignore for most of the existence of psychology, and in sociology and in social work. Social workers are preoccupied with people down there who are in trouble, who are unhappy, and people who do bad things to their children and to each other and so on. But they don't emphasize the getting out of it enough. On the other hand, I am very fond of talking about the strength perspective, using the expression of strength perspective. But I got that from a social work book, a book by a social work professor. So we're not in psychology alone with this. We certainly share it with several other disciplines, education too. As far as psychology is concerned, for me, it provided me with a long stretch of joyous work, really joyous work. Reading, writing, teaching, and getting other people interested. This is fun, man. This is fun. The South African Psychological Association was established in 1948. I think it was in Kimberley, the meeting. But it was basically the university professors who established it, but all the universities were involved. And gradually, psychologists became members. It was a new thing and it didn't take off very fast, but gradually it developed into quite a strong organization. It was accepted by the British Psychological Association, the Dutch one, and so on, as a fellow organization. But I don't know precisely when you see Concreur, you'll get more information on that. But at some point there, a black psychologist at NIPR and a professor, I forgot the man at the NIPR's name now, but a professor at University of Zululand, is an Indian man. The two of them applied for membership. And there was nothing in the Constitution that said anything about race or color. And Concreur, who was secretary at the time, simply administratively accepted them. But then some of the members discovered that they now all of a sudden had mixed membership. And this was a shocking thing. This was not admissible. And so they attempted to change the Constitution, and there was a stopgap attempt to say that they could accept blacks until there were 12 of them, and then we would help them to establish their own association. Well, that one was just voted out very quickly, because it was stupid. And this happened at a Congress in Stellenbosch in 1962, or 61, 62 I think it was. It was very hotly debated. We spent at evenings large portions of the day about this, debating this thing. And eventually it was brought to the vote. And the Cape Town people actually did what the ANC nowadays does. Well, they bussed in people. They brought in as many votes as people, all the psychologists who could vote. But I think it would probably have succeeded even apart from the UCT people or the Cape Town people. And the vote was against changing the Constitution. So we came out of that Congress just the same as ever before. Then there was an attempt to get legislation to prevent it. And I know about that because my Prof. Hartung was Potchefstroom, was one of 3 people who were sent to go and talk to Jan de Klerk, who was then Minister of Education. And Jan de Klerk said yes, he would introduce legislation to that effect. But when it got to cabinet level, the cabinet was divided about it, and they said no. John Foster specifically, he was still at that time, he wasn't Minister of Justice, he was whatever the title is, but in any case, he was a member of cabinet, and he specifically was against it. And there was enough division in the cabinet that nothing of the kind happened. Verwoerd then wrote a letter to the people who were involved in this, saying that the nation shouldn't always wait for the government to do things, that the nation should sometimes take the initiative. So they took the initiative to establish a separate association. It was called the Psychological Institute of the Republic of South Africa, PIRSA. There was a meeting in Pretoria, it must have been in 1963, early in the year. All the psychologists at Potchefstroom went there. I went along. I wanted to see what was going to happen. As I walked into the hall, I met a former colleague of mine at the railways, and I said to him, "Did you sign here?" He said, "No." I said, "I didn't either. There was a list on which you signed to resign from the old association, and then one on which you signed to join the association." And this was more or less bloedrivier, the way it was handled there, with religion and politics mixed up as you can't believe it, like just the Broederbond could do, because the Broederbond was behind all of this. In any case, they established the thing. There were several people who were prominent in the civil service and the education departments and so on. They sent out circulars that people should join this association. And the should was really have to. They did another thing. They opened it where we had a rule that full membership was only for people with a master's degree, and associate membership was for people at most lowest qualification was an honors degree. They opened it up to people who had a BA degree in psychology. In the process, they immediately had a very large membership, larger than the old association. But some of us then stayed out, Afrikaners. Dawie Gous was one, Louis Kamfer was one, Dreyer Kruger was one. I can't remember. Ampie Miller was one. But Bob Schleerbusch was one. A significant number of Afrikaners, but a smallish group. Afrikaners were forced into that one, really. A friend of mine, a very good friend from university days, told me he was principal of a school, but he had an MA in psychology. He'd never bothered about membership of an association. He said he virtually got an instruction to join. I was in a very odd situation because I was the outsider in Potchefstroom University. I just never said anything. But then the second circular that came out from PERSA said that they were organizing a congress and I was going to read a paper on clinical psychology. I wrote back and I said, "I'm sorry, I didn't join the association and I unfortunately will not be able to present there." And that's had the cat among the pigeons. Next one, this was the first circular. The second circular came in which they apologized to Dr. Strumpher if they had embarrassed him in any way. But with the full details, he didn't join the association. Of course, it made me a black sheep of the family. Just above that, there was a little item that said, "Welcome to Professor Chris Coetzee, the rector of Potchefstroom University, who accepted as an honorary president of the association." Now these two things next to each other was sending a message. Okay, nobody talked to me about it. Nobody bothered about it really there. After the second Congress, Professor Hartung came back to me and he said he now had an instruction to come and talk to me. Other people feel that I should be with my people. It was wrong to be away from your own people. I said to him, did they think that this came easy to me? I could tell him that I literally one night did not sleep on this problem before I had done nothing, decided not to do anything. And I said, this is a value thing, it's very deep-seated, and I'm not going to change. He also said to me that the vice president of the CSIR was going to talk to Dawie Gous and pressure Dawie Gous to also come into the new organization. Subsequently, Dawie said to me, he said to them, when do you want my resignation? My job is waiting for me in America. And that was the end of it. They never bothered him again. Hartung then said to me, the cabinet was divided on this issue, and he will tell people that his department is divided on this issue. And that was the end of it. He never in any way put pressure on me from a political point of view. He just left it at that. You're there, we're here. It's sad that we're not together. We don't go to the same conferences anymore. But that was what happened at various places. Louis Kamfer was at Port Elizabeth as an associate professor. He was offered a job at Rao as professor of industrial psychology. He came for an interview. The next morning, the head of the department phoned him at the hotel at the airport and said to him, "You have the job provided you just join PIRSA." Louis said, "I don't want the job." There was that kind of pressure, but okay, it was typical of the times, but gradually it died down. As the older people who were the hotheads became less active, the younger members of PIRSA began to say, but this doesn't make sense. And they actually changed their constitution to remove the color bar from it. And that opened up the possibility that we could get together again. And we then established a committee on which Lily Gerdes and Con Kruger and I represented SAPA. We started talking. But by then, the clinical psychologists had said, this is nonsense. We don't want politics involved, and established their own clinical society. Counseling psychologists then did the same thing. So in the end, it was 4 associations that we had to get together. And that took some doing. You had to have a constitution that satisfied everybody. And the first draft of that constitution was written by Rita and myself. The two of us put it together and then took it to the committee. Well, we were assigned to do it because we were representing different associations. She was from the counseling. What I proposed was association based on something in Rensis Lickert's organization style, with separate units but not with one central body. It was a very flexible association. It didn't get to be like that, but it was very detailed, discussed in detail. It took some years, I think, I don't know how long it was, 2 or 3 years eventually before. By then they started, after about a year of this, the first Congress was held here at RAU, where both associations came together. It was a joint conference, and it was said the Joint Conference of Psychology. And then at the next conference, where the two were meeting together, we established the new association in Bloemfontein. And that was then, I suggested that instead of SAPA, we changed the name to PASA, Psychological Association South Africa. And PASA then was the new association, which lasted for some years, quite successfully. After the radical change in the government level, it was before 1994, it was specifically Sats Cooper and a friend of his, an Indian guy and a colored guy, were leading the opposition, who said that this is still an apartheid-oriented organization. And eventually a new organization was established, and in PASA we supported it and joined up to form PSYOPSA that exists now. So that's the history of bringing them all together. It wasn't a happy history because there was extremism, in my opinion at least, extremism to the opposite side. And it wasn't, congresses weren't, initially at least, I haven't been to one for years now. The last one I attended was a pleasant congress, except at the opening meeting where the president spoke and talked about the white Afrikaner males who had done this and that in his opening address, with a platoon of overseas people also present on the platform. I felt like walking out because it was disgusting what he was saying. I thought, I can't walk out because he would say, you see there. But after that, I resigned from the association because I felt I couldn't really, I was retired already, couldn't afford to go to congresses. And all I got out of it was the journal. Then some time later I applied for emeritus membership first, and which was just a routine thing. And then I was told that the Constitution has been changed to wipe out that category. We could become honorary members, but we have to submit a CV and apply for it, and we have to continue paying membership fees. And I said, I don't need that. You don't apply for anything that's honorary. It's given to you. And I can get the journal in a library, that's all. Forget it. So I'm out of organized psychology for, I don't know how many years already. And then things went badly again in PIRSA, and eventually the industrial psychologists, where I still was active, separated out and formed SIOPSA. SISA is 'n nuwe vereniging wat heeltemal nuut that was established anew. It was a brand new organization, but PASA joined in there. And we attempted to bring everything together that could be brought together. It was an active thing from PASA side too. We acknowledged that we were part of this lengthy history with PIRSA involved and so on, and PIRSA was obviously involved in PASA as half of establishing the thing. So we could see the logic of establishing something drastically new. And then SIOPSA was part of, it wasn't, I can't remember the labels, but it was an institute first of SISA. And then through a variety of things that happened that weren't necessarily always pleasant, but in any case, SIOPSA went their own way. Well, as far as my experience is concerned, this was the most important thing that has happened in psychology through my lifetime. Of course, it didn't happen out of the blue. I did write an article on it, on just the history of, because there was, particularly after 2000, when positive psychology was officially born, there was this idea that this is an entirely new thing in psychology, and that is not the case. I wrote an article in which I pointed out as far back as William James in 1884 or somewhere around there, 1886. In his writings already you could see this kind of thing. William James was a sickly neurotic. He studied medicine, hardly could get through it, was interrupted. He went, I think he had a nervous breakdown and so on. And then he became almost the father of non-experimental psychology, although he was also good in that. And he became a top philosopher in America. Overcoming an early part of his life that was very, very sad. And there are numerous such examples of people who had everything against them, and yet, for instance, the people who survived the Nazi concentration camps, some of them were in a desperate shape. But that was where Antonovsky got his idea. He studied women, the basic idea. He studied women who had been in the concentration camps, went to Israel eventually, and were at menopausal age at the time when he and some other people started studying them. And he said that there were those who were neurotic, those who were physically ill and so on, who were maladjusted people, but there was a significant proportion of them who were healthy, who were good mothers and grandmothers, who were active in their communities and so on. And now what was happening here? And that's where he placed the emphasis, and that was the start of his thinking in that kind of direction. Maslow decided to study self-actualizing people. They do it. So I think that is the thing that seems to me to stand out, that there was a gradual growth in a positive outlook on psychology. And it wasn't born overnight. It came a long way. Slowly, gradually, people became aware of it. It would be continuing in the same direction for myself. I can't imagine going back to anything else. But I've been all over the place in clinical, in developmental, in industrial, straight industrial, old-fashioned industrial psychology, organizational, health psychology. So that I'm not defining myself as anything in particular, or specific field of psychology. And it would be somewhere in this conglomerate of areas. Oh, if it's other people who have to do it, there's a world of research to be done. For me, I do think now and then, I still have an article. There's one that's now with other people, and it'll come out fairly soon. The two groups that we studied were proto-team members on mines and special task force in the police, and then comparing them with ordinary police and ordinary mine workers. And that's straight organizational kind of stuff, but it's individual psychology and health psychology kind of things together. And that's the kind of field, kind of research I think we should do. No longer straight this or that or that. It's the broad field, an integration of various things. They all come together. I mean, if you study middle age, well, where do middle-aged people live? Their parents, their grandparents, they work in companies, they have senior positions by that time. So if you want to study middle-aged people, you can't look at them just from one point of view. Okay, research often forces you to do that, but one thing that is lacking in my life is that I never did group kind of research, large projects with many people. 2, 3 with assistants or other people over a period of time, colleagues. But nowadays, research really calls for teamwork. And I was at Potchefstroom University last week. Last Monday. And I was listening to Marie Wissing and to other people there, Vera Ruiz. They are working along with people in education, in social work, in dietary science. What do they call physical education nowadays? Whatever. Biokinetics, thank you. And they plan large projects in which each one of these disciplines comes in with its own kind of way of investigating things, but this one can gain from that information, from that, and so on, and all this cross-fertilization that's possible. And they each publish in their own journals, but they also publish together across. And that's the kind of research that's in the future. I couldn't continue as an individual researcher. The NRF also doesn't give you money for that even anymore. Read. Whatever you can get. You know, shortly after and we never got to that, but the split in psychology, at the first Congress of the old SAPA, South African Psychology Association, Bob Schleerbusch, who was professor at Pretoria University, for his keynote address, talked about what we can learn from general novels, general literature. And I wish I had a copy of that lecture. But that's why I'm saying read. Anything that any good author has ever written in general field can teach you psychology, sociology and education, all kinds of stuff. But then, of course, in your own field and the I have been saying to students, don't just go to the psychology journals in the library or on your computer. Look at the sociology, look at the social work, look at religion and all kinds of fields around us, because we can't have blinkers anymore. Blinkers has been what killed science, the development of science, or not killed, but prevented it from developing well enough. And nowadays, there's no field that can be independent anymore. There's neurology that's really basically important in psychology. The sad thing is that you can absorb just so much. You eventually have to pick some area and at least for a few years work on that. I've been jumping around and so on. But neurology, genetics and stuff like that are basic to psychology. And any student should really be keeping his or her eyes open. And it's darned hard work. But you've got to do it to stay ahead in your own field, plus at least be fairly well acquainted with things that happen next door.